The Devil's Dice Box by Jack London. We worshipped at alien altars. We bowed our heads in the dust. Our law was might is the mightiest. Our creed was unholy lust. Our law and our creed we followed. Strange is the tale to tell. For our law and our creed we followed into the pit of hell. The Mammon Worshippers. Not only do I know of these things from the finding of the manuscript, but I helped bury the man who came out of the East. I knew the other men before they disappeared into the East, and I also know that they never came back. It occurred in the old days, before the great discoveries on Bonanza and El Dorado, in the times we called the Klondike the Reindeer River. There were about 100 white men scattered through all that vast wilderness, perhaps a score of us, because of a great faith in the upper country, being in winter quarters where the Stewart River flows into the Yukon. It was in April, when our grub was running short, that I trailed a wounded moose through many creeks and over many divides, camping on the track by night and hungering for the kill. On this day he headed for the northeast, doubled, then broke for the Stewart River, crossing it 50 miles from its mouth. I found a dead Indian woman on the ice, a half-breed, for all she must have suffered, still very beautiful. She had starved to death, for her squirrel-skin parka had been cut away strip after strip, and the tops of her moccasins also showed the Indian manner of appeasing hunger. I looted her, and being in great pain through lack of food, continued after the moose, leaving the body to go down with the ice when the river broke. I found in the grub pouch a piece of partially chewed leather, a little over 5 pounds of large nuggets, and a birch bark manuscript, which is here printed. I purposely disguised the location of the place, for some day I shall go there myself and come back very rich. Here begins the story proper. It is all so strange and horrible, I can hardly realize that I am dying. And to die in the possession of boundless wealth, to die in the treasure chamber of the world, is the hardest part of it. And again, the strange fatality. Is it merely a peculiar chain of circumstances? Or is it a curse imposed by that first man from over the mountains? Oh, why this medley of bloodshed, murder, death? Can none escape the... But I must calm myself. Let me begin at the beginning. This Indian woman was once a mission girl of the coast, and she writes as I tell her. Perhaps after I am dead, she may reach civilization and give my tale to the world. In the beginning, there were 7 of us, 8 counting the girl, located on the 3rd island below the mouth of the Stewart. We were soldiers of fortune whom chance had thrown together, and little was known of each other's antecedents. We had all been several years in the Yukon basin, while our leader, Inuit Kid, had put in no less than 7 and knew the country as few men ever did or ever will. The half-breed Lucy was his wife, whom he had brought from Haines Mission on the coast. Then there were the 2 Randolph brothers, claiming kinship with the famous Kentucky family of that name, 2 sailors who had adventured together the whole world over, and a young college graduate, Yale man, if I remember rightly, named Charlie. We never knew him by any other, for he had evidently fled some scrape at home and desired to hide it. As for myself, the least said the better. Let it suffice that I had lost my partner in an ice jam the preceding fall, and then drifted into my present company. It was in the short days of December that the first of the many things I shall speak of occurred. Night had just fallen, and we were smoking, yarning, and sewing moccasins when the dogs set up a racket. Then we heard someone cursing and the sharp slash of a dog whip, followed by a knock at the door. Before we could open it, the man from the east came in. His first words were, "For Christ's sake, a smoke!" Charlie thrust a live pipe into his hand, and he fell to puffing with long sighs of satisfaction. Tall, dark-eyed and black-whiskered, with the muscular leanness habitual to one who travels the long trail, he was as graceful and handsome a man as ever delighted the eye of a woman. I have often thought that this was the cause of the trouble which afterward came upon him. In answer to our question as to where he came from, he pointed toward the east and went on smoking and sighing. We scented a mystery. Never before had we heard of a man coming out of the east, nor had we ever dreamed of it being done in winter time. We made him comfortable, however, and as he stayed over several days to buy dogs for the trip to Dyea, we managed to get a few inklings to his history. In the first place, we backtripped his trail and found it led out of Stewart River, and in the second, he had brought over 100 pounds of gold on his sled, every bit of it being large nuggets with an assay value of over $18. These are the facts, the rest being caught from his lips and pieced together. In the summer of 2 years previous, in the company of two French Canadian half breeds, he canoed and portaged from Lake Athabasca to Great Slave Lake, and then down the Mackenzie to the 65th degree, or in a line with Bear Lake. There they waited till the first snow, when they abandoned the river and faced west into the Rockies. After a year's wandering in that unknown region, ever continuing westward, he had encountered the headwaters of the Stewart and journeyed down to the Yukon. He spoke incidentally of the loss of his two comrades, nor was he shy in the exhibition of his gold, frankly telling us that it was merely a sample of what he had discovered. Beyond this we could gain nothing, for he kept his lips resolutely sealed on his previous life. Still, disguise it as he would, there was a certain vague smack of the man of the world about him which I could not fail to recognize. Despite our solicitations, he prepared to set out on Christmas Day. He had just harnessed his dogs and was preparing to pull out, when a bunch of dog teams, fresh from the coast, pulled in. We were at once struck by the similarity between him and the leader of the arrivals. Even before salutations could be exchanged, the explosion took place. The new arrival gave a start of surprise and covered our guest with his rifle. The latter's sang-froid was remarkable, for he smiled with a peculiar mockery of the lips and said, "Ah, brother mine!" That was all. Not another word passed between them. Their understanding was too good for that. The scene which followed would be highly improbable among ordinary people, but all things are possible to the men who face the dangers of the dreary Northland. It seemed like an appointment, long since made, to be kept at this time and place. Rifle in hand and back to back, each paced off 50 yards and faced about, while we drew out of the line of fire. Never did Christmas Day look down on a stranger scene. It was high noon, and the upper rim of the sun, barely showing above the southern horizon, cast a blood-red streak athwart the heavens. On either hand a sun-dog blazed, while the air was filled with scintillating particles of frost. A great silence prevailed. A moment they faced each other. Then, as the new arrival counted the customary 1, 2, 3, rifles came to shoulders and began to speak. Such was the rapidity of our guest's fire that for 6 shots he kept a shell constantly in the air and then went down, bored through the lungs. His opponent was more deliberate, firing but 3. But he had not escaped unscathed, for a bullet had cut his mitten string, a second had smashed a couple of ribs, while his right arm hung useless, the work of a third. He staggered across the snow to his brother and gazed upon him with great satisfaction. We raised the stricken man to a sitting posture, and as he showed a desire to speak, his brother bent over him. We never knew what he whispered, but his look of mockery as his soul passed was a keynote to the stranger's sudden anger. He unsheathed his hunting knife and would have stabbed the dying man, had not Inuit Kid dashed his fist into his face, knocking him backward into the snow. There was a slipping of mittens and a clicking of rifles among the newcomers, and the broil would have become general had not the stranger gained his feet and stepped between. In response to his orders, the sleds were unlashed, the loads shifted, and his wounds dressed. Then he was swathed in robes and tied to a sled. The whole thing had happened in less than 5 minutes. The stranger had arrived, killed our guest, and departed. Men think and act quickly in the Northland. Stowing the body on the roof of the cabin so that the dogs could not get at it, we entered and held a council of war. The sailors emptied the 2 50-pound sacks of nuggets on the table, and from this moment the madness began to grow. Even Lucy, for all her impassive Indian nature, was so fascinated by the glittering heap that she could hardly cook dinner. After a few minutes of talk and conjecture, Inuit Kid returned with the information that the strangers had turned into the Stewart River. Confusion prevailed. Even the woman understood its import. Charlie thanked all the heathen gods that men could not hide their trail in the Arctic, while Inuit Kid thumped the table and swore that he would be the first in at the kill. Then came the planning and the question as to who should stay behind. Then the madness broke out. Man after man swore roundly that he would not be left, while the quivering of Lucy's nostrils and the fact that she always followed her lord and master settled the matter for her. And there we sat, gazing on the yellow heap, thinking the strange things and dreaming the strange dreams that men always do when this thirst of thirsts is on them. We soon settled it by all hands going, and buckled down to the work of getting ready. Sleds were strengthened, harnesses and moccasins made and repaired, and every dog and every pound of dog food to be obtained for love or money skirmished from white and Indian. So bust were we that when we pulled out the following morning, we left a notice for the first comer to bury the man on the roof. And so the madness grew, for when one fails to bury the dead at his door, he is indeed ready to be destroyed. A brave sight we made with our 8 sleds and 50 dogs. While the ordinary team is from 5 to 7 dogs, we had 12 to the sled. Still, though we did not have to go ahead and break trail for our dogs, we were 3 days in overtaking them. It was plain that they were traveling fast. Contrary to our expectations, however, there was no trouble when they discovered our pursuit. Nay, they did not evince the slightest surprise when we overhauled them. We did not like this, and that night, and for many nights, we kept watch. Nor were we alone, for reconnoitering in the direction of their camp, Abe Randolph discovered that they had taken similar precautions. Though we knew they knew the location of the treasure, they did not know that we were ignorant of it. Each party knew that the other could not give it the slip, because the pursued always breaks a trail for the pursuer in an Arctic chase. It was like 2 racers riding easily and waiting for the sprint at the finish to settle the matter. To an onlooker, our race must have appeared ludicrous, for we alternated day by day in going to the fore and breaking trail. Yet this was the only understanding, for both parties maintained a rigid silence. Such a contest would have been bearable under ordinary circumstances, but here food was too precious to lag by the wayside. How the dogs suffered! We were forced to stint them in their allowance, at the same time working them to the utmost. By the time we entered on the 3rd 100 miles, they began to play out. These we shot and fed to those which still kept their legs. The January days were very short, and at the best we could not knock out more than 20 miles, often not as much as 10. But the heavy work told on us, and at night we crawled into the snow and slept like dead men. How the leader of the other party stood it, I cannot imagine. Often we heard him cursing with the pain when the sled he was lashed to jolted over rough ice. But his was an indomitable spirit. Not only did he stand it, but his ribs so knitted and healed that when the period of intense cold came, he began to leave the sled and walk. It was a case of have to, though, else he would have frozen. But we were all tired and worn, and one of our party began to break under the strain. It was not the girl, God bless her, for she was born and bred to the trail, but the Yale man. He finally became so weak that he could do nothing. Then we forced him onto the trail as soon as he had breakfasted, while we broke camp, lashed the sleds, and harnessed the dogs. We always overtook and passed him in a couple of hours, and long after we had pitched camp and eaten supper, he would come staggering in, nearly dead. Though also very tired, the other party was in fair condition, and perceiving our plight, cruelly, though of course fairly, took advantage of it. They increased the hours of traveling. Yet while we kept up, it was too much for Charlie. They no longer waited for us to take our turn in breaking trail, and gradually began to pull away from us. What could we do? We had lost so many dogs that we had already abandoned 4 of the sleds and every surplus article we possessed. Each man even carried his rifle and ammunition when previously they had been packed on the sleds. Slowly, though we never spoke or hinted of it, the question took shape. Were we to abandon Charlie or the treasure? 3 more days we forced him to the pace, but by the last day he no longer suffered. Though we still stumbled along on his snowshoes, he had lost consciousness and laughed and cried and babbled about his people, his home, his childhood days. Once he regained consciousness long enough to realize how slender was his thread of life and to beg us to shoot him. That night the other party traveled 4 hours after dark, and it exhausted Abe and John Randolph to drag him into camp. He could not eat and slept like a log where he fell, his moccasins scorching in the fire. Next morning they broke camp 2 hours earlier than usual, and we found it impossible to get Charlie up. His brain would rouse, but his body could not respond. He was not sick, only exhausted. Rest was the only medicine for him, and we could not give it. We found 4 more of the dogs unfit for travel and had to shoot them, else we would have lashed him to a sled. The sleds were loaded, the dogs were harnessed, but we waited and tried in vain. As Old Sol dipped over the horizon at meridian, we rose to our feet. The moment had come. We looked into each other's eyes coldly and without emotion. Lucy's face, though her throat was silent, voiced an eloquent appeal. The madness was on us. We could not yield. The snapping whips and lunging dogs roused him, and by the look on his face, we knew he understood. It was a piteous look, the look of a wounded doe or of a seal at the killing. So we left him because of the madness, and small wonder that our gods forsook us as we forsook our comrade. We took to the trail in silence, the first to break it being Lucy, who dropped back to the side of Inuit Kid and pleaded in low tones. He reluctantly consented to her taking the back trail. She was with us in a few minutes, but we noticed that the holster above the hip was empty. Then a shot rang out, and we knew that Charlie had passed beyond the toil of the camps and trail. They were so bent on losing us that they traveled far into the night, so far that we could not overtake them. The next day had a similar ending, and it was not till the evening of the 3rd day that we pulled into their camp. As before, they showed no signs of surprise, though we could see that they eyed us pretty thoroughly and noted Charlie's absence. With shame, we had noted the same, but by neither sign or word did one comrade show another his heart. We were sorely tried by the work, by the inexorable morrow which constantly fled across the snow. Hard as it was to struggle on, still harder was it to struggle against the desire for rest. What would I not have given just to cease for one day from all action? How I envied my prosaic boyhood days, nay, I even envied Charlie. Often I thought of blowing out my brains to get the peace I so hungered for. For the first time I understood the terrible significance of Longfellow's lines. The sea is still and deep, all things within its bosom sleep. A single step and all is o'er, a plunge, a bubble, and no more. And during the long hours of toil, with the monotonous grind of the steel-shod sleds and the perpetual uplifting of the snowshoes, they were always in my thoughts. But the great lust, the madness, kept me up and prevented me throwing my revolver away. Nor did I suffer alone, for we were all light-headed, babbling and staggering along like drunken men. All except Inuit Kid and Lucy. Their pluck was superhuman. Not only did they take their pain without sign, but at the labor of cooking, pitching, and breaking camp, they did double duty. The intense cold made it harder. For 2 weeks the thermometer had been ranging under 50 degrees below zero. For 8 days it had been below 60, and now it sank past 74. At this temperature, our painkiller, our only and entire medicine chest, froze solid. How much colder it got we could not tell. Our faces were frozen a purplish black and covered with great scabs, while we were in continual agony from our feet. Constant snowshoeing had developed large running sores on the soles. Our dogs were dropping fast. There were barely 20 left out of our 50. But it could not last forever, and one morning our quarry turned out of the river, taking a small tributary leading from the left. The chase was drawing to a close. A day's journey up this brought us to its forks, where we camped, a good watch being kept so they could not slip away from us in the dark. Dawn found us underway again. We were in the Rockies now, almost to the backbone, and the branch had become a gorge. We felt sure that the end was at hand, looked to our weapons, and made all arrangements for the final sprint. All day we fought our way through the cold and snow, and when nightfall and the end of the gorge appeared, we were sorely disappointed. But imagine our astonishment when the quarry strained at the divide and with axes began to cut steps in the hard snow for themselves and dogs. No sign of camping, so we figured that our goal must be very near. We cleared the crest as the rising moon silvered the snow and found ourselves on a large plateau, above which towered lofty peaks, dismal and repellent in their white splendor. Up to now the course had evidently been clear, but when the other party began to travel by compass, we swung abreast and feigned great interest in our own. So well did we play our game that our opponents never knew our utter ignorance of the location of the treasure. It was a beautiful night, and the ghostly Arctic silence enveloped us like a shroud. The cold was bitter, every breath cutting our lungs like a knife, while our faces were masked with ice. The stars looked down unpityingly, nay, exultantly, as they danced and leaped as they always do in the great cold. Suddenly, in the very center of the plateau, their dogs were forced to a gallop. There was a general loosening of knives and pistols as we followed suit and swept along, still abreast. It was weird indeed, this last stretch of a mighty race. Men, gold-thirsty, 1,000 miles beyond the uttermost bounds of civilization, in the heart of the Northland wastes, running neck and neck, for they knew not what. Of a sudden the dogs threw themselves back on their haunches. We were on the edge of a great hole, which seemed to sink to the heart of the tableland. Round, perhaps 300 feet in diameter, it was a sheer 1,000 to bottom. The walls were everywhere perpendicular, save in one place on the opposite place, where erosion and successive slides had broken up the precipitous formation. It seemed like a great dice box, and to complete the illusion, at the bottom were 5 enormous cubes of stone. Cursing, lashing, mushing the dogs, we skirted the dizzy edge at full gallop, nor paused, taking the steep descent like madmen. Side by side, Inuit Kid and the stranger leader led, followed by both parties, men and dogs, confusedly mixed together. The sleds turned over and went down sideways, backwards and upside down, dragging after them the dogs, which had flown at each other's throats. We tried to escape the tangle, but were swept off our feet and carried along. It was a veritable avalanche of life. In our pell-mell progress we dislodged great quantities of snow, on the breast of which we were carried along like a swimmer on the crest of a wave. We overtook and enveloped the 2 leaders in the common ruin, and naught could be heard above the roar of our transit, save a confused treble of snarling and cursing. I cannot even now understand how we escaped total destruction, but escape we did, fetching up among the great blocks of stone on the bottom. Groaning from our wounds, we dragged each other out of the mess, disentangled the dogs, and counted losses. 2 of their men had been badly crushed. One of our sailors had broken both legs, while half a dozen dogs had been torn to pieces in the fighting. The moon had now passed beyond the rim of the pit, and darkness was about us. We stumbled upon a small, single-roomed log cabin, and into this both gangs crowded. After a little delay in thawing the fat, a bacon-grease slush lamp was lighted, and we gazed about us. It was an ordinary cabin, with a rock fireplace enchinked with moss, but on a rough table was heaped a pile of nuggets, worth perhaps $40,000 or $50,000. As this was but a foretaste, we paid little attention to it. Underneath the table were fragments of a human skeleton, perchance that of the original discoverer. On top of the gold we found numerous pieces of birch bark covered with writing. It was in French, and one of the other party translated it aloud. Over 20 years before, we learned, the writer, sick unto death and deserted by his comrade, had laid him down to die. He had wandered here from the Hudson Bay Company's posts above Athabasca and discovered the treasure. He described his theory of its deposit and dwelt at great length on the cowardice and treachery of his partner, concluding by calling down a curse upon the gold in the name of all that was most holy and most diabolical. I shudder now as I think of those terrible words, and if ever a curse was efficacious, this one was. Beneath it, another hand had dated 10 years later and written, "Ha ha! Though his partner died, I am here, and by all the saints, it won't work with me. Donald Ross." Another one took up the strain, evidently our unlucky December guest, for it was dated but 3 months back. It ran, "Poor devil, he laughed before he was out of the woods, but he laughs best who laughs last. Ha ha ha! Griffith Benson." We all burst into laughter as the reading finished, partly hysterical, I'll admit, but with a ring of derision, satisfaction, and blind egotism. Of course the others had succumbed to the potency of that first man's curse, but we knew it was different with us. Most truly, we were mad. The fireplace was soon roaring, supper cooked and eaten, the wounded men made comfortable, and the rest of us turned in. The cabin had been divided between the two gangs, each setting a watch through fear of treachery. Morning brought with it the discovery of the mine. In short, the whole bottom of the pit was the mine. Bedrock had been trapped in several previous workings, and every one was rich beyond our wildest dreams. Fine gold, coarse gold, nuggets. One could simply shovel it out. Panning and rocking was unnecessary. It had only to be picked up. Evidently, in the cycles of the dim past, a great quartz ledge had reared itself for thousands of feet above the present hole, and by erosion, the action of ice during the glacial period, or some other freak of nature, it had disintegrated and deposited its golden spoil. We could not even hazard a guess as to how the pit had been formed or what had come of the debris, though we were sure of some subterranean outlet, else would it have been filled with water. Gold there was, and in plenty for all, and I believe we would have soon reached an amicable division of it had not fate been against us. Both parties were at the tail end of their grub. We killed our dogs one by one, went on short rations, and searched the whole country round for game. Moose or caribou, and all would have been well, but the best the hunting parties could do was to knock over an occasional partridge or snowshoe rabbit. The country seemed barren, and even this small game disappeared at last. It was now straight dogs, but the dogs were thin and the men hungry, so they did not go very far. We had still 4 left when the other party reached the end of its tether. For 2 days their hunters returned empty-handed, and food did not pass their mouths. Of course, we could not whack up, and of course they could not starve peaceably. The outlook was dark indeed, and though no word was spoken, many the black scowl was cast between. Affairs reached a crisis on the evening of the 3rd day. After lengthy consultation in a corner, their leader left the cabin. There was a snarling among the remnant of the dogs, and the next instant he staggered in, dragging one of them by the scruff of the neck. Everything followed like a flash. Lucy sprang for the dog, but Inuit Kid caught her a backhanded sweep of the arm, hurling her into the corner. At the same instant the Frenchman threw his hunting knife. Just as Inuit Kid clinched with the stranger, it whistled through the air, burying itself in his shoulder. The work was too close for rifles, but revolvers and knives played merrily. The golden table and the slush lamp went crashing over, and by the deceptive firelight we fought like fiends. It was give and take, without mercy and without quarter. When opportunity permitted, a wounded adversary was always finished. Even the stricken, underfoot, used the overhand slab on the combatants above them, or gave each other the quietus. 2 men clenched and rolled into the fireplace, from which arose the sickening smell of burning flesh. Nor was I idle, till I went underfoot and a great darkness came upon me. I have heard of the Kilkenny cats, but never did I dream of taking part in a similar combat. A week has passed since the battle, and I alone am left. In fact, I alone had life when Lucy overhauled the shambles. Grim is the irony of fate. Shortly after the battle, she shot 2 moose, so she is in no danger of starving. But she is busy preparing a stock of meat, and I know that she will strike out as soon as I am dead. Heaven help her, for she faces what few men dare face. Should she succeed, of whomsoever gets this, I ask to treat her kindly, and if any of the treasure is obtained, to give her a fair share. I would advise him, though, to shun this spot, for of a verity it is the pit of hell. But I know it is useless, for what can bid him pause when the thirst of thirsts is on him? My time is near. Though I may wander, I behold the signs. Often I hear thunder of the rolling dice, and see my comrades there at play. Soon I shall go to join them in the game. Should this chance the eyes of my people, I sign my name. Thus may they know my death, and that in sorrow for the wrong I did them, I met it. James Raylington.